Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brad Bernatek, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I lead our investment strategy for our national K-12 education work related to social emotional learning, which is a key priority in achieving our goal of increasing the number of Black, Latino, and low-income students who earn a high school diploma, enroll in post-secondary education, and are on track in their first year to earn a degree or credential. I'll be moderating today's web seminar. Before we jump in, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to go through. First, given the size of the audience, everyone's microphones will remain muted. Ask questions or share comments, please use the chat box function. To ensure that we see your question, please select everyone in the drop-down menu within the chat box function. Finally, please note that we will share a copy of this slide deck and a follow-up message after today's web seminar, and we will place the deck and a recording of the session on the Grantmakers for Thriving Youth website, thrivingyouth.org. The full landscape analysis and an executive summary are available on the Aspen Commission website. So to begin, today's webinar presents the high-level takeaways from the recently completed Social, Emotional, and Academic Development Field Landscape Analysis. The Aspen Institute National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, in partnership with Grantmakers for Thriving Youth, commissioned this analysis from the Boston Consulting Group. GTY and the Commission sought insights into the field's current capacity to enable all young people to acquire the skills and capacities needed for success in learning, work, citizenship, and life. Formed in 2016, Grantmakers for Thriving Youth is a funders forum employing 3 key strategies to increase knowledge, connections, and alignment among funders in this space. First, GTY informs and engages funders through events like today's web seminar and a quarterly newsletter. Second, GTY connects and builds capacity among the grant makers on our steering committee. And finally, GTY catalyzes and influences grant making through priority issue work groups focused on policy, out of school time, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and changing cultural narratives about young people. There are currently 19 organizations on the steering committee, and more than 300 funders receive GTY's quarterly newsletters and invitations to learning events such as this. Funders are welcome to join the GTY mailing list at thrivingyouth.org. So, in addition to being one of the founders of GTY, in 2016, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation joined with GTY colleagues and other funders to launch the Aspen Institute National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. The commission has convened a diverse coalition of leaders from education, research, business, policy, and the military to develop a shared vision for redesigning education based on how children learn and develop. The commission has drawn from lessons learned during 2 years of field hearings, site visits, and conversations with students, teachers, principals, parents, and community leaders across the country to develop a cumulative report from the nation. The report will share high-level recommendations on integrating social, emotional, and academic development across learning settings and will be publicly released on January 15th, 2019. The report will be released with 3 briefs that provide greater detail on the Commission's research, practice, and policy recommendations. The Commission's agenda for change aims to catalyze an evidence-based, holistic approach to learning and development. To that end, the Commission is also developing a sustainability and implementation plan for critical stakeholders and partners. The landscape analysis is a key piece of information contributing to the development of this plan, and we also hope it will be useful to all stakeholders in the field. Now, Lane McBride and Kate Rapisarda of the Boston Consulting Group will present a summary of the analysis, discuss key high-level takeaways, and share a relational map of the field. Lane and Kate will share their findings for the next half hour or so, and then I will moderate a discussion. Please use the chat box to provide your comments and questions throughout. Lane and Kate, over to you.
Folks in the room, Lane.
We're still on mute, Lane.
You guys are on mute.
Yep, we're off mute now, Kate. Sorry.
Hello?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. Sorry about that. Really two things that we want to do in the next few minutes. One is to give an overview of this landscape analysis of the field so that those on the webinar are able to use it as a resource in your work. And we have some ideas about how you might use it. And then the second objective is to share at the very highest level some of the takeaways across the landscape analysis. You'll see in the next few minutes that it got to quite a level of depth, and so we won't be able to get into everything, but we've tried to harvest some of the kind of most critical high-level takeaways that cut across the full analysis. So to start with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kate, who will talk a little bit about the process that we followed to conduct the analysis and what it includes.
Great. Thank you, Lane. Can everyone hear me on the phone?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So if we jump ahead to slide 5, good afternoon, everyone. Again, as Brad mentioned, and Lane, I'm Kate. I was the project leader on the team involved in this work, and really excited to share some of our findings with you this afternoon. So if we jump ahead one more page, want to spend the first couple of minutes really talking through the contents of the landscape analysis as well as our approach to the work so that everyone on the call is really oriented to the resources and then can take those back to your own organizations and use them most effectively with your teams. So 4 core content components to the landscape analysis. The landscape analysis narrative, which covers the first 2 points on this page, is the fairly large, I think it's 188 slides in total, deck that you should have also received as part of the registration for the webinar. That will also be posted on the Commission's website, and we have the link to that at the end of this deck. But the landscape analysis narrative is really the first 2 components on this page, the first of which is a detailed analysis of existing field capacity to actually implement social, emotional, and academic related practices like those outlined in the Commission's recommendations. So, today we're going to talk through some of the takeaways from that analysis. The second part of the narrative is an overview of lessons learned from prior change efforts. So our team looked at 5 movements, both related to or directly within the education space as well as outside of the space. So we looked at Common Core, teacher evaluation, advanced placement, and a few others outside of the space. And so that's another component that you'll find within the landscape analysis narrative. Separate from the narrative, but part of the landscape analysis, we also explored connections between field actors that were identified through our research and that we visualized through a series of relational maps. So again, today we're gonna talk about some of those findings, but the resources there include both an Excel database of all the actors identified, as well as then a set of materials that actually visualize those relationships. And then finally, while we're not gonna go into the details of the work today, the sort of 4th component of the analysis was an exploration of perspectives and frames that characterize the field, and that work is being led by Stephanie Jones out of Harvard, and is a really integral part of sort of the Commission's work more broadly going forward. So jumping to the next page, want to share a little bit just about the inputs that led to the development of the landscape analysis. So we used secondary research, we did a series of interviews, we collected philanthropic data, and then did a website review for the actors identified. So just to briefly touch on each of those, our team reviewed several market reports as well as prior analyses that had been done within the field. Our intention there was really, given the timeline, we wanted to really leverage what had already been developed and use that as a core input to our work. And that full list of reports and analyses that were referenced is available in the landscape analysis narrative. We also facilitated about 100 interviews across both the commission's partners, as well as several other organizations that weren't directly affiliated with the commission's work, but were really integral to the space and important to the movement going forward. Hopefully, many folks on the call today, we got the opportunity to speak with. We also collected data from 16 funder organizations that allowed us to get a deeper view into sort of the different types of programs and initiatives that we're being invested in currently. And then finally, for, again, the specific field actors that we identified through the landscape analysis, we reviewed their websites to get a deeper understanding of their program and the specific work they were doing related to social, emotional, and academic development. On the next page, want to touch just briefly sort of on what the landscape analysis can and cannot say about the current state of the field based on our methodology and the approach that we followed. So, you know, as we go through our work today and you dive into the narrative in more detail, a few things that I would call out. One, just, you know, the landscape analysis very much captures descriptions of programs and their focus areas, you know, and in some cases, the reach of those programs where there was existing data either through reports or on their websites. We tried to look into sort of information on demand and in some cases quality based on, again, sort of like the prior research and analyses that had been done, but we did not do sort of objective review of programs based off of our own rubric or framework. All of that work, again, was sort of leveraged by reports that had already been put out by other institutions in the field. As I mentioned, we looked at philanthropic data. We captured information from 16 organizations, which portrayed a really rich picture of some of the programs that are being invested in, but again, you know, acknowledge that that is not the full picture, and we did not collect data from all funders that invest in this space. And then finally, you know, the narrative really looks at an understanding of field capacity for implementation based on all of the inputs described on the previous page, but is not necessarily inclusive of sort of the full view of implementation across practitioners. We got a lot of information on that through our interviews and through the reports that we analyzed, but didn't do sort of a comprehensive deep dive into the state of implementation across districts and schools. So moving to the next page, before we go into the actual takeaways and the content of the landscape analysis, you know, want to share just a few more details on how the work is actually organized. Again, you know, it's a big document, but hopefully it's organized in a pretty clear way that will allow each of you to really dive in where appropriate. So the narrative itself is oriented around the 14 implementation levers that you see on slide 8. So school and program design models, technical assistance, networks, and so forth. For each of these, there's a chapter, and we'll look at the contents of what those chapters include on the next page. But these 14 implementation levers, you know, one were developed through much iteration with the Commission's working group that spearheaded the project, and were really meant to be sort of inclusive of the critical levers for implementation of social, emotional, and academic practices, and also intended to be kind of comprehensive of the various field actors that would be critical for success. So, you know, acknowledge that there may be other ways to organize the work, but this was, again, sort of how our team landed on capturing all the various components of the content that we sought to through the landscape analysis. And then finally, on slide 9, so the narrative itself is organized around these 14 levers. Each sorry, if we just jump to the next page. Each of the chapters within the landscape analysis is oriented around the 14 levers and then goes into additional detail on that specific component. So within each chapter, you will find an overview of existing field capacity, which essentially covers, what is happening in the field today related to social, emotional, and academic learning. There's also a synthesis of sort of based on the current state, where are there key opportunities or gaps that may exist as we think about the work going forward. We've also included, where appropriate, any salient data that we found on, again, sort of program reach, program quality that were highlighted in the reports that were reviewed under impact data. And then finally, within each chapter, there's a synthesis of the key actors that that fall within that particular lever. So this is definitely not a comprehensive or a list of every single actor that that falls in that space, but we did try to capture, again, through our interviews and through the research we did, who the most prominent and sort of the key actors were within a particular lever that were critical to the work now and going forward.
So Kate, we received a question from Lillian asking when this data was collected.
So the data was collected sort of this spring through the summer of this year. A lot of the reports that were used were from the last couple of years, however. But the interviews were all done kind of April through June of this year. So with that, we'll turn it over to Lane to actually talk through some of the takeaways from the landscape analysis work.
Great, thank you, Kate. So as Kate has just said, the full landscape analysis has really in the narrative some different stories. There's a story about social, emotional, and academic development as relates to curricula. There's a story about social, emotional, and academic development as relates to technical assistance and as relates to policy and advocacy. What I want to do in the next few minutes is talk about some of the themes that really cut across those 14 different stories that are in the more detailed landscape analysis. And you can see some of the themes as we flip to the next page. So at the highest level, we found that there is a tremendous resonance of social, emotional, and academic development and strong demand expressed in many different ways. There's a need for more clarity about the destination, some exemplars, lived examples of the things that the Commission is recommending, and also for a better understanding of the path from here to there. There are opportunities and needs to build the capacity of the field, the capacity of both organizations, schools, school systems, OST providers, and also the ecosystem of organizations that support them. And there's a need for strengthened collaboration across the field that can build on some of the progress that the Commission and its partners have been able to achieve in the past couple of years. And so those are some high-level takeaways, and now we'll kind of click one level deeper into each of them. So we go to the next page. In terms of demand, we found, and this I don't think will be a big surprise to most anybody here, there's some sort of soil conditions for this that are quite positive right now. Under ESSA, there's an opportunity for significant action at the state and local level. There's mounting evidence that really kind of reinforces the argument that the Commission has made and reinforces the case for a whole child approach. There, in contrast to some other movements and some other reforms and attempted reforms in education, there is a real resonance with frontline educators, both leaders and teachers and professionals who work in out-of-school settings. And on the supply side, there's an increase in available resources. There is a, more curricula, there are more tools than there have ever been to support this kind of work. And, we see this reflected, if you look at the other side of the page, in what's happening. There are, to pick out a few examples, over 15 million students in the U.S. who've taken an assessment related for some sort of continuous improvement related to social, emotional, and academic development. Many of those are school climate surveys. If you look at the work of CASEL, both at the state level and the district level, there's been tremendous demand for both engagement at the state level, where I believe CASEL has about 25 states involved in their Collaborating States initiative, and tremendous demand at the district level for an integrated approach to implementing social and emotional and academic development, including now, I think, 20-some odd districts that work with CASEL, and reports that demand exceeds that. And there's also an increase, if you look at the bottom row there on the left, in the number of states that have adopted social and emotional competencies formally. And that period, I think, was from 1 to 8, but there's a projection that CASEL's made that number is headed to somewhere in the high teens by the end of 2019. So there's really a lot of demand and a lot of adoption, which creates opportunities, and it also creates some risks. And that, I think, takes us to the next page. So the second theme is around the need for exemplars and implementation knowledge. And when I say exemplars, this is to say, we heard from stakeholders that there are not that many lived examples, particularly at the scale of an entire district or system, of the integrated approach to social, emotional, and academic development that the Commission and its recommendations are espousing. And further, there is a lack of clarity about the pathway to get there. So, one of the things that's both beautiful and challenging about this space is some aspect of the recommendations likely is present in 95% of classrooms. There is some, if not intentional, at least expressed implementation of social, emotional, and academic development everywhere. But there's not a great alignment around a language for talking about the difference between the type of implementation that the 95% do and the type of implementation that the 5% do. And that has some real consequences, as spelled out on this page. So one of the things that we saw in our conversations was an equivalence drawn between the part and the whole. So schools or out-of-school settings where there was a singular program that was being implemented, and it was sort of assumed that SEL was being done, and that was it, whether that was a discipline program or an explicit instruction program or mindfulness or some other specific thing, and that was defined as, quote, doing SEL. Even where there's a broader understanding of a more integrated approach, there can be a lack of knowledge. And so you see an example in the second place around many schools administering climate surveys, but not necessarily having a really clear sense of what to do with the data that those generate. And, there's a very important interdependency here with equity. And you can see the third example on the page around SEL or other sorts of similar programs being put in place without sufficient training for teachers or OSD educators to understand how to unpack conscious or unconscious bias or explore what inequities might occur as a result of the programmatic implementation that they're following. And finally, there's an intersection here with measurement. There's a need for more measures at really all sorts of levels to inform continuous improvement and to be able to, like I said earlier, describe what different states of implementation look like and be able to differentiate among them. So that's one theme around understanding the steps of implementation and the destination of implementation in more detail. As we go to the next page, we also found that there are real needs, if it is to be that the Commission's recommendations are to be implemented. There are real needs for building capacity at really, almost every level and in every corner, which is not to say that there's not some really good and really encouraging work going on, because if you look across the broader landscape analysis, you'll see we found that too. We found really, emerging examples of success in every category that we looked, but we also found needs. And so you can see, some samples of this on this page, from more curricula that integrate social and emotional competencies in core academic subject areas to, an opportunity where there are many, many emerging place-based networks focused on continuous improvement in education. Some of them have an explicit focus on social and emotional and academic development. Others, that's not one of the things that they focus on. There's an opportunity in pre-service training where there are some specific examples of pre-service institutions and programs that have an explicit focus on either with teachers or other educators or leaders building competency around social and emotional development, but others, many others don't. And there's not really an organized movement such that they would. And you can see other examples on this page in various other categories as well. Really, we did find that there's a need for significant development of capacity. One of the things that I think that implies is that this is a long-term play. This is a movement. This is, if the commission's recommendations are to come about, this isn't about implementing a singular thing in a short amount of time, but rather doing the hard work of building capacity, particularly in cities and metro areas and rural areas and in states, and also in national organizations that support them. And that this is at best a long-term play, which isn't to be discouraging, but just to sort of point out the reality. And then finally, the last thing I'll highlight as a cross-cutting theme, if we move to the next page, is around the need for field collaboration. And there's, in general, at the highest level, if you look at the left side of the page, a belief that the commission has made some strides, and a belief, if you look at the right side of the page, that there's a need for the movement to grow even further looking forward. So first of all, that without any sort of organized infrastructure nationally to organize an ongoing coalition, it's unlikely that the recommendations of the commission would be implemented significantly. And then in the middle of the page, there's still some very specific opportunities to expand the coalition, to grow both the depth and breadth of the partnership that sort of characterizes the coalition supporting social, emotional, and academic development. And this both means deeper engagement of some of the constituencies that have already been engaged with the National Commission, including the civil rights community, academics-focused education reform organizations, the business community, the youth development community. And also, this is it's a unique area where there's so many different movements and initiatives that are adjacent to each other. The Venn diagram is quite complex, but there's a real need and opportunity to build bridges among social and emotional learning and some of the ones, character development that maybe have been seen as more near in to what SEED, quote, is all about, but many of these other adjacent movements as well, you can see listed on the page. And a final point here, we heard very resoundingly from stakeholders that this coalition cannot itself be something that competes with the field, but rather it has to, at every turn, support, highlight, and align or facilitate the alignment of those who are active in the field across the country. So that's a summary of some of the high-level takeaways from the landscape analysis. I'm now going to turn it back to Kate, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the relational map and the relational mapping takeaways.
Great. So as you can see on slide 16, through the development of the landscape analysis, we identified several actors across the field, again, both sort of directly related and integral to the work, as well as involved in the space, but maybe not doing social, emotional, specific initiatives. And it was really exciting through our work just to see the breadth of organizations that are involved in this space. So on this page, we just have some of the examples listed, but across our landscape analysis, we profiled 314 total organizations, 224 of which were found to, in some way either have initiatives focused or related to social emotional learning, or be entirely focused on that work. So you can see again sort of the breadth of types of organizations that we profiled on this page. So these organizations served as the starting point for the relational map work that we did, and that work was primarily focused really on exploring the relationship between field actors that, again, were either focused entirely on social, emotional, and academic development, or were at least doing initiatives related to that space. So that subset of 224 actors was the focus of that analysis. So on slide 17, just to quickly kind of talk through the approach we followed to actually develop these visualizations. You know, we started off with the database of actors that had been identified through the landscape analysis work. So primarily from our interviews and from the reports and analyses that were reviewed for that work. We then spent some time just researching and understanding these programs in more detail, both again from talking to folks that we were interviewing, as well as you know, reviewing websites for a better understanding of the program focus, whether this was an organization, again, that primarily did sort of social, emotional, and academic development related work, or it was an organization that was within the education space, but not with direct initiatives directly focused on social, emotional learning. We then, for each organization in our database, went to the website and actually identified, you know, who were the publicly listed partners and funders of those organizations, and captured those. And those partner and funder relationships were actually what formed the basis for the work and the connections in the relational map. So the tool that we used, it's TouchGraph Navigator. It's a free software that can be downloaded online. Was the program that we actually used to visualize the relationships that showed, again, focused on those 224 seed-focused actors, how they were actually connected to one another through their stated partner and funder organizations based on their websites. So that was the approach. Want to spend a little bit of time like going into that data and sharing some of what we learned from the analysis. So if we go to the next page, there were three, I would say three focus areas for the relational map work. The first and foremost was really looking at how the organizations in our database were connected to one another, and really trying to understand, you know, which types of organizations, you know, so like philanthropic organizations or training focused organizations. So if you think about those broad buckets, the implementation levers that we use to organize the work, which types of organizations, as well as which specific organizations were, you know, the most and least connected to that landscape of seed-focused actors. And then second, at the sort of individual actor level, we use the tool to really deep dive into the particular relationships that a specific organization had, both within and outside the social emotional space. And then finally, you know, from our research, we sort of captured this very large list of partners and funders across the database of actors, and did some work to really explore those organizations and see what opportunities might exist for engagement going forward. So on slide 19, just again sort of to orient ourselves to the data and what was captured in the relational map. Started with that list of 224. Again, those were actors in our landscape analysis database that had some focus on social, emotional, and academic development work. When we went to the websites of those 224 actors to identify their partners and their funders, there were 900 unique partners or funders that were identified through that research. Of that total group of 908, 105 of them were essentially organizations that were listed in that group of 224. So, for example, Class Dojo is an education app. It's focused on communication and behavior management. It was part of that original list of 224 seed-focused actors. That Class Dojo was also listed as a partner for other seed-focused actors. So PERS, which was another organization in the database, listed Class Dojo as one of their partners. So there was that group of 105, which again were seed-focused actors named as partners or funders. And then there were an additional roughly 800 organizations that were listed outside of the seed-focused actors as partners or funders. So this included corporations, other organizations in the education space that hadn't come up through our landscape analysis. So if we move to the next page, want to again sort of look through some of the findings and insights from the data. On slide 20, we've broken down the list of 224 actors by implementation lever. So you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, implementation written there, and then a few takeaways from this. One, the largest portion of actors in our database in the work that we did were within the school and program design models sort of bucket, which is probably a function of two things. One, likely indicative of just like there being a lot of existing programs and providers in this space, but then two, definitely a function of our process and the fact that many of the research reports that exist that we reviewed for this work were focused on programs, on curricula, on existing models in the field today. So there was sort of a rich amount of data for us to work from that focused within that lever specifically. Another thing just to note is that, while it's a roughly even split across several of the levers, there's definitely, the majority of the organizations in our database of 224 did some seed-focused work, but they weren't exclusively, or primarily focused on social emotional learning. If we then move to the next page, so geographically, we also looked at where the organizations were located based on their headquarter. And as you can see, several of which is likely not super surprising, but we're concentrated on the East and the West Coast, as well as in sort of urban and surrounding suburban geographies. And again, sort of similar to the point on the previous slide, while definitely feel that this is directionally accurate in terms of where where these programs are concentrated. This distribution is both a function of kind of our analysis and likely our approach. And there would definitely be more analysis needed to really understand, what the true concentration of seed-focused organizations or all seed-focused organizations are across the U.S. So as we move to the next page, so this is or one slide that shows the actual visualization, which again was really interesting to explore. We're going to zoom in on sort of the central map, which is the center of this diagram, in a minute, but just to sort of orient everyone to kind of how the network came together. So when you run the data through the visualization software, you get the network map that you see on this page. Roughly 60% of the organizations in the database were connected to one another through a partner or a funder. So 143 or so organizations are concentrated again in the center of this map and are connected based on, listing another organization or being listed by another organization as a partner or a funder. And then the organizations that you see around the periphery that are not connected, either, did not have any, there were several organizations that when we went to their website, they just didn't list partners or funders. So some of the organizations there either didn't list partners or funders and also weren't listed by other organizations as a partner or funder, or potentially listed partners or funders, but there was just no overlap with our database of 224 seed actors. So those unattached organizations are the ones that you see around the periphery. So if we sort of zoom in on the central map on the next page, a few things to call out, and I know it's a little bit difficult to see even here. We have some additional cuts of the data that actually zoom in on different parts of the map in more detail that we'll definitely share with this group following the webinar. But we created several cuts of the data, and a few things that I just want to sort of call out from what we learned. So if you squint a little and look at the center of the map, the magenta colored organizations, and actually one thing just to note is the organizations here are color coded by the primary lever that we organize them within the landscape analysis narrative. So if you look towards the center of the map, the most central organizations which are in magenta are philanthropic and funder organizations. So sort of unsurprisingly, these were most frequently sort of mentioned as partners or funders across our database, and therefore really cluster pretty densely together in the center of the map. You also can see several, neon green as well as blue organizations. So green are the conveners of the field and blue are research institutions. So these also tend to cluster closer to the center, given sort of their close association and relationship with the philanthropic organizations. So those sort of three different types of organizations really made up the core of the relational map. And then as you scan the periphery, a few other sort of takeaways to note. One is that both TA providers, which are in gray, as well as professional development organizations, which are in red, they're less central to the map. So they're sort of found in different places along the periphery. They don't appear as well connected, which, to us sort of represented a potential opportunity to think about how we can sort of connect them more closely to some of the other actors in this space for purposes of sharing best practices and learnings across those domains. And then lastly, the final group I would just call out are the national and regional associations. Those are in yellow. What was interesting about those organizations is they actually tended to have a really, really large number of connections. So when they tended to list several partners or funders on their websites, but they had very few connections actually to the social, emotional, and academic space, which again was the focus of this analysis. So another place just to kind of think about and explore where there might be opportunities to engage those organizations more meaningfully, especially as we think about how powerful that could be in terms of their geographic reach and sort of expansive network of engaged individuals across the country. So if we move to the last page that we have in this presentation on the relational maps, I guess a few final call outs from the analysis. So as I mentioned, the sort of third thing we looked at was that 908, that broad pool of actors and organizations that came up through the website review and through what our seed focus actors had identified as partners or funders. So we did a deeper analysis of the partners or funders within that group that were listed most frequently. So there were 50 organizations that were identified as a partner or a funder by 4 or more seed-focused organizations. So when you look across this group of 50 and the frequency at which they appeared, across our seed actors, it's probably not hugely surprising that many of these are philanthropic organizations. Those are shaded in the sort of the dark blue. It's also probably not hugely surprising that many of these are also seed-focused actors. So in red, you have organizations that do seed-related work and were represented in the analysis. But one thing that did really stand out is there are several 20% of again sort of these high-frequency partners were corporations and companies, and again just sort of raised the possibility of potential opportunities to further engage the business community, which is clearly involved in this work based on this analysis, but really kind of pushed our team to think about what might be those additional pathways to engage the business world as experts, as thought partners, or for additional sort of funder and partner relationships going forward. So with that, again, there's sort of more work behind this that will be shared with folks on the call, but want to turn it back over to Lane to talk about next steps and open it up for discussion.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to hit on a couple of things really quickly and then go to questions for the rest of the time. So there's really kind of 4 broad ways that we can see the landscape analysis being improved upon. Certainly, like I said earlier, like Kate said, this is not a universal capture of all the organizations doing this work, and particularly state and locally focused organizations are not fully captured in this analysis. Most of the organizations have a more national scope. There are some ways, in particular with the relational map, I would call that a beta version. There's some ways we can refine the analysis to ensure it's more accurate and more comprehensive. There certainly is additional data that can be collected on all the actors that are profiled. You can see some examples here on the screen of ideas that were raised in discussions with the steering group that we worked with. And finally, there are ways that aspects of this can be automated and made more efficient in terms of collecting the information. So I'd be happy to talk more about this, but I think that covers at a high level some of the ideas about how this can be improved upon going forward. Broadly speaking, if we go to the next page, there really are 4 things that we envision an organization might do with the landscape analysis. So the first is just to use this as a synthesis of many different existing sources to try to capture the state of the field, use it for kind of broad informational purposes. Second is to enable organizations that are active in the field to identify potential partners or others who might be doing something interesting that's similar to what they're doing or could complement what they're doing. Third, we see an opportunity for this to inform funders and also implementers in the field around where they might prioritize their efforts given needs and gaps that are observed. And finally, the analysis on lessons from other movements can inform everyone's work. So those, I think, are relatively logical, but we hope that this will be useful in those different ways. So why don't I pause now, and Paula is busy writing down questions. Jackie has some questions here, and let's do it.
Okay. Hi, hello, everyone. This is Jackie Jodel. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission, and I'm going to field, we've got a whole host of questions here, and I'm going to start to field some of the questions for Kate and Lane. So there are a number of questions that came in regarding the map.
Yeah.
And I think a couple are important to answer. The first one is there a comprehensive list of all actors that were reviewed, and what program or application was used in the map, and what were the assumptions that were built in? So kind of questions around the tool itself.
Yeah. So there is a database. I mean, it's just an Excel spreadsheet that lists all the organizations that are in the landscape analysis that was used as the source data for the relational map. And we were talking about that on mute a few minutes ago. I think we'd be happy to find a way to share that with everyone. The map itself was created using a program called Touchcraft Navigator, which I believe can be downloaded for free. Kate, is that right?
Yeah, it can be. You can at least set up a free trial online, and then they have various sort of subscription services beyond that.
Yeah, and so we would be happy to provide both the instructions for how to use Touchcraft and the source data so that you could recreate the map and manipulate the data directly if anybody would be interested in doing that.
Okay. Can you mention, do you have comments on why companies would be, or how companies have been engaged in SEL training? I don't know if that
Sure, yeah, no, just to kind of go to that last slide that Kate was presenting. So those were companies that were identified as either funders through their corporate philanthropy or partners of actors that were in the landscape analysis. And so, you know, that's how they would be involved. One of the things that was interesting to us is that there's not necessarily a level of organization around the business community's engagement in this space that you could imagine, but yet individual companies are engaging with groups that are doing seed-related work in many, many places, and so we see a real opportunity there.
Okay, so next question. Did you talk to specific schools about who their partners are? How did you reach out to educators in school districts as part of this work?
Yeah, so the we did, but I will say the methodology of this analysis was not a demand side heavy approach. And to sort of translate that, we did not do a massive survey of schools or school systems to ask them about who their partners were. We did, as part of our secondary research, use some other analyses that had done that as a source for this. And so research that Castle had done, research that other organizations had done, existing things that were landscape analyses of the field that had that more of that approach. In addition, we interviewed educators who were directly involved with the commission, either on the commission or part of the Council of Distinguished Educators. And we also interviewed a selected set of educators who were not affiliated with the commission, just to make sure that we had some balance to potential bias of those who were affiliated, knowing about one set of organizations, and those who were not affiliated being more familiar with a different set.
Okay, there's a great question on youth voice. Did you look at youth organizing groups or how young people are engaged in organizing around equity issues in their community that builds seed capacities?
So the short answer to that is yes. There's a chapter because one of the implementation levers that was identified early on, one of the 14, was around youth voice and leadership, and that's been something that the commission has really valued in its work. And so there is a chapter within the longer landscape analysis where we looked at youth voice and youth engagement.
Okay. The related question, I think this would be great for one of our commissioners, Camille Farrington, but are there opportunities to look more at the role of agency and leadership in young people's development, as well as the relationship between individual development and systems change? This is some of the work, I'll answer for Camille, this is some of the work that the consortium is doing at the University of Chicago related to these things. But if you want to comment, Lane, on what you saw in the landscape analysis.
I would say we looked at that from the perspective of supporting, of the importance of youth voice and supporting a movement in the field. I would say in terms of the kind of reciprocal benefits back to the youth who are participating, that was probably more in the purview of the recommendations of the commission rather than the landscape analysis. I think it's important that wasn't really the core of our remit for this.
Okay. And then we have a question on, did you include in your research on how engaging young people and okay, oh, we did ask, all right, Kathleen. Yeah, Kathleen is forwarding a question. We did ask that question. Okay. That has come up twice. I'm trying to make sure we're representative of all the many questions that are coming through.
So there's one question that just came through in the chat around the analysis of the map on the landscape is scattered and disconnected. So I would say there are a couple of things to think about there. One is, like I said earlier, this was a beta version of the analysis, and it was dependent on organizations listing their funders and partners on their website, because that was the way to look at 250 organizations simultaneously in a reasonable amount of time. A further iteration of the analysis, you certainly could imagine surveying those organizations directly to get them to provide additional information that would give you a more complete database. And if we did that, I would hypothesize that you would see more connections in the map. On the other hand, there are some parts of this landscape that don't seem to be well connected. I would say one of them, that we had a hypothesis about is the business community, that you have individual companies engaging in this work, but not necessarily a conversation, at least the level of conversation across the business community and between business and educators that there could be. And certain other areas like technical assistance to school systems and OST providers and third-party providers of in-service training, those landscapes are extremely fragmented, and you really do see small consulting organizations and support organizations working in localized ways and not necessarily connected to each other or to the broader field. So I think it's a mix of both. It's a mix of some real opportunities for connection and also some, frankly, opportunities for improving the data, and the understanding that it gives us about what's going on.
Did you do an inventory of the seed actors by geography, which is interesting because it relates to the notion in your theory of change to develop local place-based capacity?
Yeah, they are tagged by headquarters location. That slide is in these materials. I think there's more work to be done to capture the full kind of richness of what's happening at the state and local levels in this area. I would say that this has some more well-known and promising snippets of that, but it's not a comprehensive picture of everything that's going on at state and local levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of questions about how groups, organizations were categorized or whether or not they were included. For instance, how were the AFT and NEA categorized? You remember?
Kate, do you know the answer to that? Were they categorized as national associations? Certainly in our broader database, we have the opportunity for organizations to have multiple tags. In the version that we used for the map, we had to have a primary. Kate, AFT and NEA were categorized as national associations, is that right?
Well,
I don't know.
Yeah,
we can follow up, and that'll be clear in the database, which we can provide.
I was on mute, but yes, that's correct. They were categorized as national associations.
And Kate, were comprehensive centers and the equity assistance centers and RALS included? Do you remember?
I would have to double check.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, lots of detailed questions about that. Okay. All right. I think we're just about at time. Do you want to wrap up, Lane, with questions on the big takeaways and your thoughts on what the field needs and how the field can come together? The $1 million question.
In like 15 seconds. I mean, I think the four themes from the landscape analysis are probably my best cut at what expresses that. I think that there's real momentum and energy. There is a need to have a clear, aligned language instead of measures so that we can talk about what it means to make progress in a more consistent way and bridge across different frames and different movements. I think there are opportunities to build capacity all over the place, which isn't to discourage us, but to help us to know that, probably like almost anything in this field should be, this is a long-term journey, not a quick fix. And finally, the Commission has scratched the surface of opportunities for field level collaboration, but there's much more that can be done.
All right, thank you very much. And Brad, would you like the last word and thank everyone for joining us today?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. I hope you all found this really interesting, and thank you so much for the engagement and the probing questions. And I think that this is what's the right phrase? We're not at the end. It's sort of maybe the end of the beginning. So look forward to further dialogue on this, and think of this as a first step in a journey that we're on in order to build the capacity in this field.
Thank you, everyone. We're signing off. Thank you so much.
Bye all.